whatever's, it's a bit weird. If you sit here, you've got control of that.
Okay.
But basically, whatever's on screen, they will be seen.
Cool.
And hopefully they should now be here. Let me just test it and then I'll move anyway. Just check.
How many online is there? That's
There are just there's the cat there as well. There's 12 online.
Is the internet working properly?
Now, what I've had to do, I don't know if you've noticed. Hi, Vivian. So, everybody, this is Vivian.
Hi.
Online student who's here from Hong Kong, who's here for a month or so at least. So, you'll get to know everybody in a minute. Yeah. Move around so one can get around the table. Yeah, I'll be back there. So hopefully they should be able to hear us speaking. So there's a microphone here. So at any time you want to talk, that's fine. Just don't drum on the tables because it kind of really picks that sound up dramatically. Yeah. Keep your phone off the table. Although actually, it's only this table, so we've only got one microphone.
You don't touch the.
So I've just sent them the link to see if they can testing whether they can hear or not. Then I'm going to send this as well. So I will be when I've got out of the way, I will be monitoring their conversation and any questions or comments that they've got of my students. I'll speak out loud. And if I should also, in theory, be able to know, I will hear stuff as well. But I'll be about 20 seconds behind in my ear to what's really.
It's very tricky.
It's a little bit confusing, but it sounds like it's working. I'm hoping you can hear okay. We'll just see how a bit low. That sounds a bit low. Okay. So let's turn up the levels a bit. Right, turn up the levels a little bit and hopefully you can hear a bit better. Yeah, a few people are saying their internet is not great. Yeah, it will buffer a little bit if you do that. The whole thing will be recorded because it's going out by YouTube Live, so it should all be recorded at the end as well. Right. Is that enough for you?
Yeah, that's great. So let me just do a quick intro.
apologies that we're a bit behind. I've literally had to gaffer tape a cable from the office through the doorways, which is highly illegal, through a fire door as well, linking it to here, and then daisy chain another Ethernet cable to get some internet into this room that's reliable enough for this today. So
health and safety.
I'm a bit behind in getting set up. We had 2 people coming around yesterday who were looking at how to get Wi-Fi in here and get a cable in, so it will be happening very soon. Vivian's online as well, sitting here, which is great. Yeah, so that's stage 2. For those of you in London right now, there's 12 people online who can see and hear. They can see everything that's on screen and they can hear whatever we say. They've got a tight conversation going on here as well. Vivian shared a picture, thank you. Yeah. And if they've got questions or comments, I'll speak those out. You can as well while you're here. But just remember that they can hear you. So if you do speak clearly. At some point in the future, you can stay on Skype if you want. So what we tend to do, we won't do it today, but what we tend to do in the future is that everybody in the room can also be on Skype as well. So you can be watching, listening, talking, and watching a tight conversation if you want to. That's quite sophisticated, but it kind of works quite well. It sounds crazy, but it kind of works quite well. So this is the first, because the Internet Volunteer last term, this is the first kind of proper visiting artist live stream talk that we've done. And I'm very, very pleased that it's Ben who's come. Ben I've worked with Ben for a long, long time now, actually. We've known each other.
Yeah.
Surprisingly long time, isn't it now?
Yeah, maybe 2012, 2011.
Yes, yeah. Ben is multifaceted. He does lots of different things and has many different things which he juggles, alongside being an artist and running creative agencies and galleries and all kinds of stuff. He's a graduate from Camberwell here, currently in the process of starting a PhD, hopefully very soon. And what I'd ask is he'd talk a little bit about his own art practice, film practice, but I'm sure you'll probably go explore lots of different things. He's done a really interesting project just recently, which I haven't seen the results of yet. So
a little bit.
A tiny bit.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Which I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit more about that. The point is that Ben's got a presentation and he'll talk to it, but at any time, this is a discussion. So at any time there's questions, anything you want to jump in at any time, do so. And if we don't get through the whole presentation, Ben's cool with that, we're fine. We'll just go with the flow and see how it goes. And we've got till about 3 o'clock, which is when a lot of the online students, for various reasons, for different time zones they're in, have to be quite strict at a 3 o'clock finish with that. So over to you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thanks very much thanks for having me. Yeah, can everyone hear online?
It seems to be okay.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, I thought I'd start by maybe talking about the project that I did when I was on the course that you guys are on now, which was maybe kind of 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And
ironically, your final show was
in this room. Yeah, that's true.
That's where the exhibitions were on this floor.
Yeah.
And
I remember
your film was in half of this room, wasn't it? There's kind of a funny wall in here as well.
Kind of wish those blinds had been there.
Yes,
I wouldn't have had to black out the space. Yeah.
I remember it would have made it much easier.
Yeah. That's really true, actually. So this was kind of the final piece of work that I did for the kind of final show. And I think one of the things I became quite interested in when I was doing kind of the MA was essentially in kind of analog film and celluloid film, and how digital technologies and processes were leading to the kind of the substitution or death of film. And one of the things I became quite interested in is this idea that, I guess, kind of in kind of capitalist societies, I guess, like often when technologies come along, the only way that they can sell themselves is to substitute what came before. So a lot of the dialogue around kind of digital photography, especially at that stage, kind of 5 or 6 years ago, was about kind of substitution. It was this idea that, digital, buy this camera is as, now as good as film. The resolution is as good as film. It looks like film. And kind of the narrative that was often being pushed at that point was this idea of like digital is as good as film now. And I think one of the things that became interesting was this idea of kind of substitution and sort of complements, and actually this idea that technologies don't need to come along and substitute one another. Technologies have obviously unique properties that allow them to be complements to one another. And I think when you look at analog film, there's obviously a resurgence that's happened in the last kind of 2 or 3 years within the medium. But at that point, artists were kind of one of the last groups of people that were helping to define the future of film, because commercial industry had abandoned the medium kind of en masse by that point. And I kind of heard this story, which I found quite interesting, which was about how some cargo ships still had film cameras that overlooked kind of the foredeck of the ship. And these kind of cameras were on like a time lapse. So they'd maybe take one frame of film, maybe every hour. And the reason for these cameras existing was for insurance. So obviously, I think around 10,000 containers are lost overboard from ships every year. And sometimes you kind of see the effects of this. Like I think maybe about 18 months ago, you might remember like in Cornwall, I think like hundreds of thousands of bottles of Vanish, the stain remover. Basically fell off a container. Yeah. And like there were all these like bright pink bottles that kind of washed up on the shores of Cornwall, and were really kind of visible because of the this kind of almost like fluorescent colour that they have. So basically, the insurance companies, obviously, when a container comes on board, the shipping company makes a claim to their insurance company, and at this point, some insurance companies would actually only take film as proof that the container had fallen overboard. So you'd have this camera, it would take a photo, and obviously one of the photos would show the container there, and then the next photo would show it having fallen off the boat. And the reason for this was because some of the insurers would insist on having a piece of film to look at, which was essentially material proof. So it was proof that that footage couldn't have been tampered with, because you'd literally have this physical piece of film where you'd have one frame and another frame next to it that couldn't have been tampered with. Whereas a digital image, their kind of argument was, oh, this could have been tampered with. Obviously now that technology has come in, and the film cameras are redundant. But at this point, I thought it was a really interesting story, and I kind of thought it'd be kind of a nice story to tell, in order to kind of bring to life this idea that film and digital are actually two separate kind of mediums, I suppose, or two separate ways of creating film. And that the two should have these unique properties that should allow them to exist side by side. So I ended up going on a container ship for, I think it was like maybe a week, kind of going around the North Sea in this kind of, sort of all around, going from kind of London to Amsterdam to, I can't remember, Le Havre in France, and a couple of other places. And made this film, which then kind of got processed and edited it, and then ended up, this is a picture of the installation, ended up kind of projecting it on film, because that's essentially what the film was about in some ways. So once I'd finished my MA, that was kind of my final project, I set up a kind of project space or gallery called South Kiosk, in partnership with a curator called Dave Charlesworth, who I've known for quite a long time. And South Kiosk is still going now, so it's been going for kind of 5 or 6 years now. And it's actually based in the Bussey building, just kind of 10 minutes down the road here. And we kind of, we don't have programming on all the time, so we've actually not got a show on right at the moment.
when it jumped just before, that's
Have any of you been to any of the Kondo exhibitions? Kind of interested in.
Where is that?
So it's like this. I think it started last year, and it's basically galleries from all around the world, and they do swaps.
Right.
So the artists that they work with, like, they'll swap with a gallery in New York or in Sao Paulo or Hong Kong or wherever. And there's probably 3 or 4 galleries in Peckham that are part of the program. So I think there's about maybe 12 galleries in London involved. So like everyone from like Pilar, I never know how you say it, Pilar Carreras in town, but then Assembly Point have swapped. I just tried to go there on my way here, but it doesn't open until 12. And then I think Hannah Barry's swapped as well. But it's worth looking at. Like, yeah.
Good idea. I like it.
Yeah, it seems like a really, really good idea. So, yeah, if you just do a search for Kondo, it should come up.
okay. So it seems like it's back again. So if you start with Emma Charles again,
Yeah.
I think they got that bit. I think. Yeah.
Okay. I've not embedded this image, have I? Sorry, it's really pixelated. So she did this kind of film. I'll go back a little bit, shall I? Yeah. Okay. So go back a bit. So one of the people that we first started working with when we set up South Kiosk was an artist called Emma Charles, who graduated from the Royal College about 4 or 5 years ago. And for her graduating piece, she created a film called Fragments on Machines, which was about kind of the physicality of the internet. And it was, I guess, like playing into that idea that a lot of the language that is kind of disseminated about the internet by corporations basically tries to dematerialize the internet. So when we talk about obviously things like the cloud, and even in finance, when you talk about kind of, bubbles bursting and stocks floating, like it's all this idea that these things are very ethereal and kind of don't really have any physicality to them. Whereas obviously, we all know that they do. The internet is obviously powered by huge, kind of server farms that use a huge amount of energy. And I think, one of the things Emma was trying to do was kind of show part of that infrastructure space through this building in New York, which, as I say, looks like a kind of an office block from the outside. But when you get inside, it's basically just rows and rows of servers. So we picked up on her work when, at her show, and we kind of invited her to come in and have a chat. And this was kind of the first work that we showed at the gallery of Emma's, which was called The Straightest Path Allowed by Law. And it was quite a small scale project. It was kind of a photographic project. And it was about a project in the US where essentially a private company had deemed it financially viable to link New York and Chicago through fiber optic cable. So what this would do is allow trades between the financial centers of Chicago and New York to happen quicker. And when I say quicker, we're talking about like literally milliseconds. And in order to kind of make these transactions quicker, what they deemed they needed to do was lay fiber optic cables. But those fibre optic cables ran through an area of kind of outstanding natural beauty in the US, which is an area called the Allegheny Mountains. And so what Emma went to go and photograph were these kind of poles, which were situated through this kind of stunningly beautiful area. And I think like the project, it wasn't so much coming at it from the area of kind of environmental destruction, because actually the fibre optic cables are, they only need to drill a very kind of small hole in order to lay those cables. I think what she was more interested in is this idea that even in the wilderness, where you expect to be totally disconnected from technologies, where she was, you couldn't even get a mobile signal. Actually, technological infrastructure still exists. And you see parallels, in this country with the undersea cables which exist in Cornwall. So, at the very extremities of the UK, again, an area of outstanding natural beauty, you have these kind of infrastructures. And actually, it's really interesting if you do go down to Cornwall and you see these infrastructures, because it's actually been in the news quite a lot recently. If you go down to a place called Porthcurno, which is right at the tip of Cornwall, and you can see the internet basically coming, landing in the UK. You can see the cable there, and there's kind of signs saying, don't touch.
If you remember, for Christmas I did talk and show those the ships floating the cables in,
Right.
and then someone hacksawing their way through it while they're reconnecting it.
It's kind of nuts, yeah. And you kind of look at it, and it's obviously, I think it's been in the newspapers quite a lot recently, because obviously people are paranoid about people coming along and basically cutting them. So her project though was set in the Allegheny Mountains, and it's a photographic project. I have got high-res images. I'm not quite sure why they've not ported through, but really it was a really nice project. And again, it kind of started the conversation with Emma that led to kind of her second show. There's a reason why I'm talking about Emma so much. I'll come on to that in a moment. But the second show that we did in our new space, so actually that last show was done when we were based in London Bridge. Now we're based in the Bussey Building in Peckham, and this is South Kiosk at the Bussey Building. And this project was called And the Earth Screamed Alive, which is, the title of that is taken from a book by an academic called UC Parika, who's based down at Winchester. And if anyone's interested in kind of ideas around things like geology of media and stuff like that, like he's
really interesting stuff.
Yeah, he's also one of the key people in Transmedia LA as well, in terms of the programming and things like that. So he's really worth reading. There's books called Geology of Media, but interestingly, one of the things that his research is starting to focus on much more now is around kind of media of the office space. So they've got a new pamphlet out at the moment, which you can download from Winchester, which again is kind of really interesting. It's all about kind of rites of passage in the office environment and stuff like that. It's UC Parika, so it's JUSSIPARIKKA. And then the other person who's there is a guy called Ryan Bishop. He again is really interesting. So Emma actually, she found out about this place called the Pioneer Data Center, which is quite famous, and it's used to be a nuclear bunker situated in Stockholm, and what's kind of quite creepy about it is that it's a nuclear bunker that above it has a children's playground. So in the advent of a nuclear attack, all the children would die, but the politicians would be fine. And it was decommissioned about maybe about 8-10 years ago. What's really interesting about it is that Swedes are now totally paranoid about Russia again, and they wouldn't decommission it anymore because of kind of the changing geopolitics of that region. but it has been decommissioned, and it was taken over by a French architect called, I think, Laborde, who basically redesigned the space and gave it kind of this like crazy sort of sci-fi aesthetic. So you can kind of see a little bit from the images there, the way the space looks. And again, kind of Emma went down this route of kind of showing kind of physicality of the internet, and what some of the really interesting things about the Pioneer Data Center, it was where Pirate Bay was basically served from, and it was also where WikiLeaks was originally hosted as well. So it's kind of got this reputation as, well, one, a very secure kind of space, but also secondly as kind of, I don't know, like, yeah, I guess that really. What we ended up doing, and actually going to show you, maybe I'll show you first actually, I'll show you a couple of clips from this film.
Current that ran through the earth electrified it. The invisible wires that ran on the surface conducted the first messages of planetary scale from no one in particular. Once thought an artificial city, the underground became the natural habitat.
Yeah, so that's just a quick extract. So that kind of voiceover that you heard was a script that was written by that academic, UC Parika, and he actually does a live performance with the film, which I'd be really interested to see. I've not actually seen that. So one of the things that we did when we were kind of, Emma and I started like working and collaborating more and more together. You'll notice that, or you might notice that was all shot on film. The idea behind that was, obviously the subject of the film was about materiality, and she was very keen to kind of show that through a kind of material medium. So I started talking to her a lot about film, because it was the first time she'd shot using celluloid film. And then when we were kind of talking about the curation of the project, like Dave, myself and Emma, what we decided to do was to create these two very large screens to kind of break the film out. And on the left-hand side, you'll notice that you have interior shots. On the right-hand side are the exterior shots. So you get this kind of duality of kind of interior and exterior. And then at the TV in the middle, you'll see there is a generator. And that generator is basically there in case power goes in Stockholm. And that generator apparently is capable of powering a city of up to 3,000 people. But instead it's there basically in case, or basically to keep data safe. I think that's one of the really interesting things about Pioneer data centers is essentially it's in a nuclear bunker. And the idea of nuclear bunkers was to keep the most important people safe in the advent of a nuclear attack. Now, the most important thing to us is data, and it's in this kind of nuclear bunker. So in the advent of a nuclear attack, our data will be safe. This was kind of an interesting thing there. One of the things we were really keen to do with the film was not to overly stylize the space. So we didn't want to make it feel like you were in the data center, because we felt like that would kind of pull away from the work itself. So we just introduced this kind of blue curtain, which you can kind of see running alongside of the space, which sort of played with the content on the screen. Yeah, so Emma and I kind of kept talking, and I think we were both really keen. This idea of kind of materiality is quite a, there's a lot on it now. You know, a lot of people have kind of covered this subject, and I think when we began to talk, we had similar interests, but we were very keen to sort of maybe go beyond that and start thinking about some new things. And we kind of hung out a fair bit and decided that it'd be fun to basically make a film together. I think fun might be the wrong word, but it was really interesting to kind of work with her. And I'll come on to that film in a moment. But at the same time that we were doing White Mountain, and the Screamed Live at South Kiosk, I was working on another project with another artist called Sebastian Kai, who also had a show at South Kiosk actually last year. And we worked on this kind of, it was quite a small scale project. It was kind of just, you know, something that we were interested in. We went away on holiday to Cornwall together. And when we were in Cornwall, we ended up kind of shooting some footage around these kind of data cables down in Porthcurno. And Sebastian's background is architecture, kind of mine is more in the film side. So we shot all this footage on what's called a Bolex, which is kind of a wind-up 16mm camera. And we sat and we designed this kind of framework that was all based around the frame size of a 4:3 camera. So basically the Bolex shoots, rather than 16:9, which is obviously what you're looking at now, Bolex shoots 4:3, which is kind of the old TV size. And that provided the start point for this kind of architectural form that you see. And what we did is we kind of built this framework within which we had projected a positive and negative image. And it was all imagery around this space where I think maybe people have gone again. No? It's weird, it just jumped out again. Just check.
Still hear it, but I'm 20 seconds behind you, so let's hope it's okay.
Okay, right. Oh, I've rotated everything, that's fine. Okay, so yeah, so we projected these positive images and negative images and built this kind of framework which had this sort of two-way mirror film in the middle. And the idea is with that is that as you kind of walked around this framework, you kind of got these distortions within the framework. So it's kind of really interesting for me to work in this way, to work with an architect, and I think one of the things that Sebastian and I are really keen on continuing to explore together is how film can operate in space. And this, I would say, is not a complete artwork. I'd say it was the start of a process of collaboration between us, where I can bring my kind of film practice and he can bring his architecture practice, and we can work out how those two things can kind of work together. So yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting project to work on. And yeah, as I say, we continue to work together at the moment. So kind of going back to Emma and myself, one of the books that I was kind of reading at this time was a book called Hertzian Tales, which is quite an old book. I think it was published in like 1998 or something like that. And it's by again, like another kind of, I guess, renowned professor who's called Anthony Dunn. who teaches the Design for Interaction course at the Royal College, which is quite it's like a pretty well-known course in the design field. And actually, one of the things that him and his kind of the person who runs the course with him, who I think is called Fiona Raby. One of the things they're very famous for is kind of this idea of speculative design. So a lot of what they do is around trying to understand the present by speculating on how things might look or behave in the future. And a lot of that is based around technology. Again, they're really interesting to look into in the sense that obviously they come at things from a design perspective. So there's always an element of kind of utility to the kind of scenarios that they explore, because it's coming from that kind of design language. But I kind of feel like it's really interesting to look at the kind of work that they do and kind of think about it from more of an arts perspective, and think about how speculation can be used as kind of a strategy to create artworks, as well as they use it as a strategy to create design. I don't know if that makes much sense to anyone. But I was reading this book called Hertzian Tales, which, as I say, is quite old. And it was about kind of electromagnetic radiation. So there's this one chapter in it. It's not even a chapter, actually. Maybe it's like a page in the book that's essentially about our electronic objects and about how their physical boundaries are bigger than the physicality of the objects themselves. So I'll try and explain that a bit better. So every object that we have, like a mobile phone, emits electromagnetic radiation. We can't see it and we can't hear it, but other animals actually can. And just because we can't see and can't hear it doesn't make it any less physical. So the boundaries around your mobile phone and your computer, if you could see this electromagnetic radiation, might kind of go more like this. Okay, and it's actual physical, it exists, we just can't see it. And he sort of deemed this Hertzian space. And he said that designers should basically think about this kind of immateriality of the Hertzian space when they're designing products and services. So it's kind of like, as I say, a lot of the stuff in it is relatively outdated now, but as a piece of kind of historical text, it's really interesting. I'll kind of go on a slight tangent for a minute, because one of the things I'm also really interested in around this time was a conference which Anthony Dunn helped organize, which talked about how product designers and industrial designers needed to stop designing products because every basically eventuality for product design had been completed, it had been done. And that how all designers should focus on big social issues such as housing and the environment. And actually, it's really interesting to think about in the context of that time, in sort of 1998, 1999, to think about the fact that there'd be a conference on how product design is a redundant discipline. When you think about now, about technology and all these kind of new things that are happening, and how ridiculous it kind of sounds to think that, 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, there's nothing else that needs to be designed anymore. So it's kind of, I'm really interested in this conference. I'm trying to find out more about it, about who spoke and the kind of things they spoke about. Sorry, I keep going off on tangents, but I just find that quite interesting. So one of the things in that book was thinking about electromagnetic radiation was power lines. So power lines are obviously circular, and they emit electromagnetic radiation. Because they're circular, they emit it in a kind of circle around that power line. And there are architectural regulations about how close you can get to power lines, precisely because of electromagnetic radiation or the Hertzian space. So actually, when Anthony Dunn was talking about when you design, you should be taking into account electromagnetic radiation. Here's actually a really tangible example of that in Japan, in a house that's basically called House Under Power Line. And as you can see, the electromagnetic radiation is in a circle, and the architect has designed the roof in a circular fashion. to basically get as close as possible to the power line while sticking within those architectural regulations. And I kind of became quite fascinated with this and with power lines, and ended up doing research on power lines. And this led me to Kazakhstan, which, yeah, I mean, this Kazakhstan is where we ended up making our film. And Kazakhstan has the most powerful power line in the world. And it stretches from a place called Ekibastuz, which you can kind of see in the middle there, to a place called Kokshetau, which is in the top left-hand corner. And basically on either end, you can see the border of Kazakhstan and Russia. On either end, the line continues through to Russia. So the most powerful power line in the world is, again, it's a total folly. So what I mean by that is this power line was mostly constructed when Kazakhstan was still part of the USSR. And it was a way of the USSR exhibiting its kind of engineering and technological prowess to the West. Actually having a power line that can carry more power is kind of totally pointless. It doesn't actually help. It doesn't make your power get there any quicker. So as I say, it's basically a folly. But follies are often really interesting. And yeah, became really interested in this power line, basically. And originally, when I spoke to Emma about it, we kind of had a very loose idea of basically following the power line and making kind of a film along it. And I think one of the things that united Emma and I was essentially kind of a fear of filming people. So in Emma's work, she always starts with a piece of infrastructure and creates a film around it. And actually, when I look at a lot of my work, I've kind of been doing the same thing. So we kind of love this idea of having the security blanket of basically having a piece of infrastructure, which was a power line, to create a film around. But suddenly, this project just became more and more kind of all-consuming. So what I mean by that is, you know, this is the power line. This is me stood kind of at the power line at Ekibastuz. But when we started to look at the map, we suddenly found all this incredible stuff about Kazakhstan. Like, Kazakhstan's kind of a crazy country, okay? So it's the 9th biggest country in the world in terms of land mass, but obviously its population, I think, is like the size of London. So it's kind of, there's huge expanses of open plains, which is called the steppe. And it's basically now the richest country in Central Asia because of technology. And the reason because of that is when we started to look at the map, there's all this mining that goes on in Kazakhstan. So there's gold mines, there's copper facilities, there's the biggest aluminium smelter in the world, there's the biggest coal quarry in the world, there's basically any sort of metal or mineral that could be involved in the production of our technologies can pretty much be found in Kazakhstan. And one of the interesting things, in fact, there's probably a piece of Kazakhstan in everybody's computers and everybody's phones right now. And actually, one of the interesting things when we were talking to a miner in Kazakhstan is that he said that as kids, they're basically told that the entire periodic table sits below their feet. And obviously for Kazakhstan, this is amazing because maybe kind of 50 or 60 years ago, I think there was only maybe 5 or 6 elements on the periodic table that were really valuable and really mined. And now that's closer to kind of more like 80 or 90% of the periodic table is incredibly valuable because of technology. So minerals that once had virtually no value are obviously now incredibly valuable. And, that has led to Kazakhstan becoming this incredibly rich country. So we suddenly were faced with this map where it was an incredible research project, because when you type into Google places in Kazakhstan, there's 3 different names for each place. There's the Kazakh name, there's the Russian name, and then there's the English name. And obviously when you put the English name in, there's very, very little about the places. Like, it was really hard to find out about anything in Kazakhstan. But what we did start to do was find all these amazing mines. Alongside that, what we began to find out about was some of the kind of secret history of Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan was essentially colonized by the Russians, and the Russians pillaged and essentially destroyed large areas of Kazakhstan in the kind of build-up of the USSR. And Kazakhstan is dealing with that history now. So there's kind of a real post-colonial dimension to Kazakhstan as well. And some of these places, some of these named places that you see, so Semi, that's down there in the bottom right-hand corner, that entire area, there were over 400 nuclear tests that were detonated in that area over a 20-year period. And that area is now completely, a lot of it is just kind of no-go areas. You can't go there. It's just completely been destroyed by nuclear tests. But alongside that, there were other places. So there's a place you might be able to see called Stepnogorsk, which during the Cold War was the biggest producer of anthrax globally in the world. So it was an anthrax town. And again, it didn't exist on maps. So there's kind of a lot of really interesting places. And what Emma and I became interested in Kazakhstan was like this idea of technologies across history. So within kind of a 50-year period, you have Kazakhstan essentially being this place where the Russians could mine uranium for nuclear production. And indeed, Kazakhstan is still, I think, the second largest country in the world for uranium production. It's where all uranium for the nuclear power stations in the UK comes from. But across history, it's this idea of mining uranium and being this epicenter of nuclear tests for 50 years to now being at the forefront of technological development through the minerals that it's currently mining. I'm going to move on from a slide of a map because I appreciate it's kind of boring, but we found it really fascinating. And consequently, this ended up with Emma and I sat on our first morning in Kazakhstan in a cafe, just completely bewildered. This was we basically didn't have a translator for 2 hours and got ourselves into so much trouble in 2 hours. You just couldn't believe it. Like we ended up being screamed at, shouted at, kind of doing loads of cultural things that you're not supposed to do. Like basically when we were giving people money, you're not supposed to put money into their hands. You're supposed to put it down on the table or it's really offensive. Kind of all these things that you obviously just don't even realize. And nobody spoke a word of English. And obviously we didn't speak a word of Kazakh. So it was kind of, it was interesting. I say we kind of ended up in Kazakhstan, like before we set off was kind of an enormous kind of pre-production phase, which, at the start of which we decided again that we wanted to shoot on film. Basically, really honestly, just because we love its aesthetic. It was nothing more than that. It was an aesthetic decision. Yes, we could make that materiality argument again if we wanted to, but I think we just both really wanted to shoot on film. So what we ended up doing is, just to give you some insight into the work that went in, we ended up finding we needed a small camera, and we ended up finding a camera. But unfortunately, that camera's not in production anymore. Kodak doesn't make film for it anymore. So we had to work with Kodak in the UK to basically hand spool a huge amount of film to take with us. We then had to do tests with Kodak, all these sorts of things to get ourselves to kind of a place where we could basically take the film with us. This is kind of me at Heathrow before we left, and like a huge amount of kit. And as part of that, one of the things that I spent probably about 6 months doing was working on the sound design elements. So one of the things that I became really interested in is this idea that a lot of the things, you know, when going back to that idea of electromagnetic space and the Hertzian space, was it's not tangible. Sorry, it is tangible, but we can't see it. So well, how can we make it visible? Well, we can make it visible by allowing ourselves to hear it. And the sound, the kind of field recordist community is really funny. It's like the film community, it's like the analog film community, where people are annoyingly kind of suspicious of outsiders, and you have to work very hard to get information out of people because they kind of don't want to let you in. It's a snobbishness thing, and it's really shitty, to be honest with you. It's really frustrating. And the sound design community was the same thing. And I ended up speaking to a lot of field recordists about microphones, about the kinds of things that we could do to reveal kind of electromagnetic radiation and things like that. Ended up getting a lot of specialist sound equipment made for us, one by a sound recordist here in the UK, and another by a guy who's based out of Slovenia, and a third from a guy who is based out of the US, who used to work with a guy called Alvin Lucia, who I would imagine some of you have heard of. Alvin Lucia was part of the kind of whole John Cage thing, and he was very interested in this thing called spherics, which is the natural sounds of the planet. So the planet basically has a radio space. And the first person actually interestingly to ever hear this radio space was Alexander Bell, because when he invented the telephone, the first thing that happened when he picked up the receiver was that he actually heard the Earth's natural radio, which are all these kind of pops and crackles. And it's really beautiful. Like if you go to YouTube and just type in Alvin Lucia spherics, you'll hear some amazing noises.
How do you spell that? Sorry.
Pardon?
How do you spell that?
Alvin Lucia, Alvin, and then his surname is Lucia, Lucier, and spherics is just Sferics. It's basically a shortened atmospherics. And he created these amazing microphones able to pick this up. The problem is these microphones only work in areas where there's no interference from man-made radio signals. So obviously in the UK, you've got pretty much no chance of hearing this kind of stuff unless you're perhaps way out in Wales or Scotland. But in Kazakhstan, we knew we'd have a chance because there's a lot of kind of open land. So this radio that you can see, which again, Sebastian actually came on this trip with us, this radio is a spherics microphone. You'll see he's wearing a mask, which was because we were at the start, we were very close to the nuclear zone. So we ended up in Kazakhstan, and the first place we went to was the biggest coal quarry in the world. It's absolutely insane. I can't even begin to get across the scale of the place. It was ludicrous. What we were really amazed at was how we did everything properly. Like we went through the embassy in the UK. The embassy in the UK put us in touch with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kazakhstan, who then organised access for us. And we thought they would be really resistant to filming. And actually, they are really resistant to filming in certain places. But because we were filming industry, they were really excited about us filming because actually they really want the world to see their kind of modern, future-facing industrial kind of industry. So they were kind of very open to us filming at places like these coal mines, which was fantastic. So we kind of got there and we had these guided tours by people who were like the nicest people you could ever hope to meet. Then we go and have these lunches in these enormous canteens. So like this coal place had a canteen pretty much the size of Camberwell. Like it was enormous, and we kind of sit there and have lunch with these people. And this coal quarry, you may be saying, well, what's coal got to do with technology? Well, actually, there's plenty to do with technology. It's said that coal basically, if you take like your computer, 70% of all its fossil fuel usage is through its production. Because most computers are made in China. China has a high usage of fossil fuels. So, there's a lot of kind of, I don't know how accurate these facts are, but people kind of saying, look, buying a new MacBook Pro is essentially the same as buying a new Range Rover in terms of its environmental impact. There's kind of a lot of kind of stuff around that. I don't know how true that is. I'm not going to say that with any factual, But anyway,
there is some suggestion that using cloud services equals the environmental impact of the total aviation industry.
Right.
So it's very, very hard to measure these things. I've actually looked into it to try and understand it, try and get some data. It's very hard to measure it. The point is that what we think is kind of really obvious, like an aeroplane, obvious, or a car, obvious environmental impact. A cloud's like using a streaming music server, and the server has to be fed by a coal power station next to it. We're using all that power. That's the problem.
So this place has dug up enough coal to keep the entire next generation of Kazakhstan in power. So one coal quarry in Kazakhstan for the next 40 years already dug up, and they've only dug up a third of the coal there, which tells you how self-sufficient the country is in terms of its resources. It's the two guys who are bent down. The reason they're bent down is because the way the coal quarry was designed is to have a natural flow of wind. So it's super windy down there. And that's apparently to get rid of the coal dust. That's why they're kind of huddled down there. You can see Emma and I, and you can kind of see the camera that we're using there, and kind of how we filmed. It was incredible, how close we got. Again, I can't tell you the scale of this thing. This is the biggest coal claw in the world, and it basically just goes around the quarry, churning up coal, and underneath it is a continuous train. And when I say continuous, I mean continuous. Basically, it digs up coal, and the train underneath, the coal goes into the carriages, and it goes on and on and on and on. And what they do is they build the railway track as this thing's digging the coal up. So you have a whole team of people essentially building railway track for this train to come, for this claw to go underneath. So it's kind of, and this quarry is open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. All through the night, they're building railway tracks, and this thing's just digging coal up. It's an absolutely insane operation.
And it's an open cast.
And it's open cast.
So it's relatively easy.
Yeah.
To get to, but the scale of it's incredible.
Yeah, and this is how close they let us to it, which was kind of amazing, but also terrifying. And again, to try and give you some semblance of scale, you can see how big I am, how big the truck is, and then how big that crane thing is, which is quite a long way in the distance. And then this is when we got back in the van afterwards, and I don't think any of us realised how dirty we were. And I remember kind of looking around at Sebastian and just seeing him and kind of just bursting out laughing. We were kind of ferried around. So once we'd gone to the coal quarry, we then went down to Semi. Again, I was actually really surprised we were allowed to film. We had to go through a secondary check, which only happened when we were in Kazakhstan. And we went through security checks done by the equivalent of MI5 to deem, that we were okay. And apparently no one had been let in for the last 2 weeks, and indeed, there was an Irish photographer the day before who was supposed to go in who wasn't allowed in. I have no idea why we were allowed in, to be honest with you. And we were allowed to film as well.
Why he wasn't?
No, no idea. Again, we don't know. But we went to, the way the kind of nuclear site worked is we went to this town called Semi, which it was a hidden town up until about 5 years ago. And it was a nuclear town. And it used to have the best nuclear scientists from across the USSR. And it's now, half of it is crumbling. But interestingly, it's now being revitalized as a nuclear town around kind of nuclear energy, nuclear technology, rather than nuclear weapons. But we went to the museum there first, which was really, really weird. We went through these security checks, and then we were taken into this museum and given this tour. And And we were given this tour by this lady who, the first thing is we had our own translator, but they insisted that we had another translator. And the other translator who came he opened the door to the museum, and he was essentially a nuclear child. Like, he'd been born in semi, and physically he had all the kind of characteristics of somebody who'd been born in a place with basically had been contaminated. He was small, he had very small limbs, and he had a really big head. Like, he was kind of like, so it was really kind of interesting that. And we found out afterwards that he was basically worked for the government, and he wasn't really there as a translator. He was there to look over us and to make sure we didn't do anything we shouldn't do. So this lady kind of took us round, and this machine here that you see was kind of fascinating because it looks like a very, kind of old kind of relic of technology. But this was actually the console where every nuclear test was started. So they press a button and all these dials would go round, and then when the nuclear test went off, that red light at the top just span round like a kind of 1970s police siren. And we got her to kind of show us this test over and over again because we were just totally fascinated by it. So we went around this museum.
So what you're saying is that you triggered loads.
Yeah, triggered loads of nuclear tests. Yeah. All in the name of art.
Yes.
Then we kind of went out into the kind of nuclear test sites. This is the guy you can see on the right-hand side. What was really disarming about the whole thing is that this guy on the right was obsessed with all our camera equipment. He was like laughing. He thought it was hilarious that we were filming on film. He was obsessed with kind of like all our stills, cameras, everything. And we'd be kind of going through these nuclear places, and we'd want to talk about the nuclear history, and all he wanted to know was like, oh, how many frames per second can that thing shoot at? It was really kind of surreal conversations that we were having with him along the way. These people, basically, they all go out to the nuclear site, and none of them wear protection apart from the masks because they have been exposed to so much nuclear radiation that they're actually on government pensions. So they all get paid, depending on how much radiation they've been submitted to, they have different pensions, basically. Whereas we were kind of fully decked out in this equipment. Again, it was very disarming because they kept telling us not to worry and that everything would be okay. But then, when I remember like Emma tried to step back into the van while still wearing her suit, and they went crazy at her, like literally crazy at her. We also went to the very epicenter of the nuclear tests, and the lady turned around to me and said, oh, you can have a walk around and film. And I walked maybe from here to where you are on the other side, and again, she went absolutely crazy at me, and she was like, if you go another 2 steps forward, you'll be contaminated for the rest of your life. I was kind of, so it's really weird, like, sort of thing. This kind of still here is them just kind of kicking basically material, like the stone down in the bottom has basically by nuclear fission or fusion, I'm not sure, I'm not a nuclear expert, but basically melted and created these tiny kind of rocks that have all kind of fused together, and she's just kind of kicking that around with her foot. These are some flowers which interestingly have bloomed in the areas where the nuclear tests are. They basically love the environment now. So they're kind of these flowers which weren't very, 50 years ago, there weren't very many of them, but now they're kind of all over the nuclear site, which we found really interesting. And this is kind of, you can see it was just really, it was one of the weirdest, most odd things. I've never felt so weird in a place in my life. And I think one of the things that the nuclear, coming back to the idea of history, and it's a very well spoken about subject, so I won't go into it too much, but one of the things that becomes fascinating is this idea that nuclear as a technology, the very first time a nuclear device was exploded, completely destroyed our understanding of history and time, because the timescales that we are dealing with are beyond all human comprehension. So a really good example of that is when you look at the tsunami stones in Japan. So the tsunami stones in Japan were only erected, I'm not even sure, like maybe it's not that long ago, like maybe 500 years ago, 600 years ago, something like that. And they were basically stones that say, like, don't build forward of this point because if a tsunami comes, you'll all die. And even like 500, 600, 700 years later, we look at these stones and we kind of mock them. And we're kind of like, oh yeah, that was 500 years ago. We now exist. We have all these new technologies. We can build in front of these stones. And of course, when the tsunamis hit Japan a few years ago, this is exactly where the water came up to. And this is exactly the destruction that it caused across the Japanese coast. So we don't listen to our ancestors. We don't listen to the things that they're telling us because we have a kind of short-term view and perhaps even an arrogance that we've evolved and that those people weren't as smart as we are now. And I think when you look at nuclear technology, you compare 500 years to a half-life of 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago, we were Neanderthal man. Like, how on earth do you communicate 10,000 years in the future that if somebody digs below the surface, they'll find something that will kill them? You can't. And actually, if you think about that nuclear symbol that we all use in the West, that kind of fan symbol, that's not even an agreed symbol. So if in Africa, that symbol simply means fan. So that's how people in Africa view that symbol. So essentially, even in contemporary society, we can't agree how to label these things. So there's a real interesting challenge about, in places like Kazakhstan, how do you communicate to people so far in the future that if they dig a hole, they're going to kill themselves? And what was really interesting about the nuclear thing is right at the very last time when we got back, we kind of talked to the lady and she was like, oh yeah, we're beginning to let people farm here again, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, yeah, but what about the epicenter? How long will that be? And she was like, she just kept saying, well, we're beginning to let people farm here. And I kept saying, no, what about where we just went? And she was like, I was like, when will that be safe? And she just looked at me and she went, never, will never be safe. So it's kind of like, there's something really interesting there that I found it interesting.
Just some questions about a bit of context. So some questions here about why they were so open. Was it because there's a sense of, how does someone put it?
The nuclear?
No, why they were being such army? Was it purely, do you think, because it was kind of, they saw some way to sell themselves? This was kind of like a trading mentality, therefore this was good PR, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two answers to that. So the first answer is when you come to the industrial infrastructure, last year there was this thing called Expo, and over history you look at how countries have essentially tried to create new identities for themselves with a global expo. After the war in the UK, there was, the expo at Crystal Palace, which was all about trying to show, British ingenuity and, inviting all countries from around the world to come and show essentially their wares. I'm sure Boris Johnson, being the idiot that he is, will say that we should have an expo after Brexit to show how great Britain is, and Kazakhstan is basically had an expo last year, which was it's all about a post-colonial identity. So the Kazakhstan is ruled by a semi-autocratic president called President Nazarbayev, who has been in charge since the country became independent 20 years ago. Some people call it a dictatorship. I don't know if I'd quite go that far, but it's close to dictatorship. And political kind of opposition is stifled. He has a very close relationship with Putin and with Russia, but at the same time, he is incredibly vocal in his criticism of Russia. So when he talks about the nuclear heritage, he talks about how the Russians have left a heritage that will scar his country forever. When another way of being able to see this is that actually one of the really interesting things about kind of semi-dictatorships, actually, when you read about it, is that he has this plan. So he has this kind of 20-year plan about where Kazakhstan will go, which no government in the West could ever achieve, because obviously they'll be voted out within 4 or 5 years. And his 20-year plan, when you read about it, one of the things that they're looking to do is to phase out the Cyrillic alphabet, so essentially the Russian alphabet, because they're basically turning around and going, well, this is not our heritage, it's not our history. Why should we use this alphabet? It's kind of redundant on the world stage. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Kazakh as a language, and we're going to use the Roman alphabet. And that is an enormous project that we'll be going through over the next kind of 5 to 10 years in Kazakhstan. And I think I was really interested at how vocal, Kazakhstan is completely in the pocket of Russia, and it's completely reliant upon it economically, but it is also a very vocal critic of it. And I would say that, there are parallels with that to a lot of other post-colonial scenarios. So the UK and potentially some of the places, where it colonized, there's similar relationships going on, which I'm reminded about every day because my girlfriend's Irish. It's, I think that's some of the reason as well.
Just following up on that then, so the way art is often used in those situations as a kind of tool of propaganda, a tool of sometimes a kind of a pacifying of the agendas, or not pacifying, maybe gold plating of things sometimes. Did you feel at any point compromised?
No. The only time that we weren't allowed to film what we wanted to film was actually in this place, this is the biggest electricity power station in the world. And the guy that we were with didn't want us to film. There was like this section where there were all these turbines, and one of the turbines had broken and it was being repaired. And he didn't want us to film the turbine that was being repaired because he said he thought it looked bad. That was the only thing. And to be honest with you, kind of understood, it was his job, it was his plan. He had a real pride in that plan, and he didn't want it to look bad. And I didn't feel compromised by that. I wasn't bothered about filming a turbine that wasn't working anyway. And I think, from our perspective, we're not trying to expose anything about Kazakhstan. We're not trying to create a kind of, socio-political film, necessarily about Kazakhstan. We had an amazing time there, and, we're not trying to create a super political film, I guess, although I'm about to come on to something that's quite political. Does that?
Yeah, it's fine, yeah.
So this was a power station, which I'll go through quite quickly. This is where the turbines were, which, yes, there's not to film. Don't know why I put this picture in. This is me I don't know why I put this picture in. Yeah, it's just me with a dolly and a camera. And then once we kind of filmed all this infrastructure, one of the things that Emma and I talked about was this idea about how one of the things we were doing in the film was kind of creating the story of technology.
Yeah. So, are you two laughing at the prices?
No. About the whole.
Oh, the whole thing. Okay, they're both Russians.
Yeah, I know.
So
I know
that
shop. It's one of the cheapest shops which sell electronics and technologies, and usually all their stuff is shit and broken.
Yeah, right.
That's why we just laugh about it.
They let us film in there, so we were delighted. But yeah, now you say that, actually, quite a lot of the screens weren't working. So I actually, when we were in the shop, I mean, the scenarios you find yourself in is I had to change film in the shop and it was really super bright in there because it's like well, it's kind of strip lighting, but like twice as intense as in here. And I ended up getting into a chest freezer to change film. So I kind of like climbed into the freezer, shut the door, and I was like there with the camera, kind of like, it's really, really weird things you end up doing.
Photograph of that, I think, really.
Yeah.
And when those are closed, you can't open them from the
Yeah, you know
that because it's sealed. You can't.
I'm lucky they opened the door for me.
Thanks for long.
So we were interested in this idea of the journey of technology from the mineral-rich earth to the city. And actually what became quite clear to us is it's not just the journey of technology from the mineral-rich earth to the city, but the city that technology spawned in Kazakhstan. And that city is Astana. So Astana is the capital city of Kazakhstan, and it's often viewed as kind of a, kind of like Dubai of Central Asia. But actually, that does the city, I think, kind of a huge disservice. So Astana was basically constructed in the last 20 years. Nazarbayev, essentially, the way he saw it was that the old capital city was so caught up in a Soviet and a Russian identity that it could never be it could never escape that. And it could never be the future face of Kazakhstan. So he decided to move the entire capital city to this space that's one of the coldest places. I think it's the second coldest capital city in the world after the capital city of Mongolia. In the winter, it's down to minus 40 right now. It's freezing, well, more than freezing. And he built this whole new city. Now, when we were there, we kind of filmed in Astana, and obviously, like everyone, we were kind of became obsessed with the architecture, and you'll notice a lot of it's blue and gold. And the reason why a lot of it is blue and gold is this identity thing. It's this post-colonial identity. So, in order to build a new Kazakh identity, Nazarbayev went pre-Stalin. So Stalin basically, when he went into Kazakhstan, collectivized the population. So basically changed the population from nomadic and pushed them into cities. In the process, around 35% of all Kazakhs died. It was an enormous kind of, transformation. Now, in order to create this kind of identity for Kazakhstan, what Nazarbayev did was look to this Kazakh identity that existed pre-Stalin. And that identity is nomadic. The Kazakhs were a nomadic people. And they believed in shamanism and Tengrism. So they believed in kind of shamanistic kind of beliefs. And some of those beliefs included the idea of the sun and the earth and the sky. And those colours are blue and gold. So essentially what Nazarbayev did is he turned around and said, I want my city constructed in blue and gold because I want it to reflect Tengrist and shamanistic principles. And so he basically put these mandates down for buildings to be in these colours, which is why everything is blue and gold. What he also did is create, you'll see at the middle here is this thing called Baytarek. And Baytarek is a Kazakh folklore story about heaven, hell, and earth, and about the dead rising from hell through what the story calls Middle Earth and then going up to heaven. One of the things Nazarbayev did, which I found really interesting, is he took these Kazakh folk tales, which had been handed down from generation to generation, and he basically rewrote them. And he made the protagonists in those stories into these incredibly brave figures, who are strong and powerful. And he cemented these stories by commissioning films about them and by having the stories rewritten into textbooks, into schools. So it basically became essentially propaganda about how the Kazakhs were this strong nation. And he created these architectural representations, and Beta-Ek, which is this tower in the middle, is a representation of this kind of identity in these stories that were essentially fabricated. So what Emma and I became really interested in is this idea that the money to construct Astana is all from Kazakhstan's mineral wealth, and Kazakhstan's mineral wealth is all caused by our obsession with technology. So Astana is the city that technology built, essentially. And this place was crazy. So Nazarbayev has worked a lot with kind of these star architects, and one of those being Sir Norman Foster here in the UK, who designed this thing called, what's it called? Khan Shatir, which basically means big tent. And it's basically a yurt-shaped structure that has kind of a fake beach in the top, and kind of this play park, which you can see is kind of dinosaur play park, and then it's a shopping centre underneath. And we kind of filmed a lot in there, which was really interesting. And yeah, we kind of filmed all over. Along the way, we kind of picked up loads of stories. So we kind of filmed these guys who are traditional Kazakh musicians playing out in the steppe. Kind of went to these kind of crazy places, which is really, really interesting. And we ended up sort of starting to make this film. So we've got a huge amount of footage, and what we've realized is that there's what started as a story about a power line actually is a story about technology and its journey from the mineral-rich earth to the city, but actually the city that technology has built, which is Astana. And within that city, Astana, there's some really interesting subtext about a nation state that is trying to basically build a post-colonial identity, and how it's using traditional folklore stories in order to do that, and how it has used architecture as a medium within which to tell the world a story about what Kazakhstan is. And Emma and I put a trailer together, which we don't really like, if I'm honest with you. And I'm only showing it to you. It doesn't exist online, it doesn't exist anywhere, because we're not kind of happy with it. But it was
this is only going live to the world.
Oh, right.
No, it's not.
That's fine.
This is unlisted. YouTube listed streams.
Yeah, so I would think about this trailer more as a collection of kind of rushes rather than anything. It's not really meant to tell a story, but hopefully what it does is just give you an idea of how the footage looks and some of the things we did. So yeah, I'll play that.
Сейчас мы с вами находимся у эпицентра первого ядерного взрыва, проведенного 29 августа 1949 года.
Here we are at the epicenter of the first nuclear explosion conducted on the 29th of August of 1949.
Не чекай нотации мне, мама, это ни к чему. Снова к друзьям я своим убегаю, что меня тянет сюда, я не знаю. Без музыки мне оставаться надолго нельзя.
Sound is all from the sort of specialist microphones that we used.
Can you hear some of this when you're there live?
Yeah, through headphones, but not in normal. One of the crazy things about standards you'll notice is just no people.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's so empty.
Yeah.
There's
One
nobody
person.
there.
And this is the shopping centre.
How many people live there?
How many people live there? I don't know. It's growing fast though because there's a lot of international investment.
А если зашли в общем, приходите, мы здесь специально вернемся.
Yeah, so it's not a trailer that we're, it's not, as I say, it's not going out. It's more just a collection of kind of almost like situations, I think. But yeah, it's a kind of start, and we've got to do interviews with a few people yet, and get on with the editing of it. But that's.
Do you know why the president chose to put the capital there, where it's so close?
I think there's a lot of there's no definitive answer to that. So some people say it is because it's close to the region where the nuclear activity was, that apparently he wanted to kind of rebirth that region. Other people say that, I'm sorry, this isn't like a Russian thing, like, as I say, but there is an argument that's made that also the capital city where it existed before was close to the Chinese border, or closer to the Chinese border, and that he wanted to put the capital city closer to the Russian border, because if there was ever an incursion across the Russian border, then it would become an international incident, because essentially troops would be marching into a capital city rather than into an area that is essentially benign and just steppe land. So there's kind of, those are two arguments that are put forward, but there's no definitive response to that, like answer to that.
So your plans with this film, everyone will notice you got Arts Council funding.
Yes.
To help support the production of this. So what kind of things are required for you in response to that type of scenario where you've got something which is deeply based in research, and you've given us a detailed exploration of that, but yet someone has funded it. Are they expecting a visual output, and what are the expectations for how that be shown, etc.?
Yeah. Okay. So the key kind of stipulation, really, when you're applying for Arts Council funding, which you'll know, is that they're interested in the work, in the sense that they're interested that they know that you're credible and that you will produce something that's interesting. But actually, that means nothing if nobody sees it. So what they're really interested in is that people will see the output of your film, of your artwork. And they're especially interested in people who don't usually engage with the arts. So the hardest sell for an Arts Council application is essentially to say something like we're a gallery in Peckham, and we'd like to put a show on that will appeal to middle class white people, because there's, obviously that, whereas if you can turn around and say, we are making a film and, it's around these themes, and we're going to take it on tour, and it's going to be shown in these different locations around England, and we're going to make sure that we engage with audiences who don't traditionally engage as strongly with the arts, then they become a lot more interested. And I think one of the really hard things for me about Arts Council England funding is that they are only interested in England, which is kind of like, I feel like it's a real shame that it's not across the UK, because it means obviously institutions that you have relationships with in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, you know, there's just no engagement there. But Arts Council...
That's partly because Scotland and Wales have their own versions.
Yeah, and actually...
But there's still no collaboration, still no dialogue.
There's not really a dialogue. And actually, interesting enough, one of the things that I'm doing the PhD, or applying for a PhD up in Scotland, where Scotland generally has more progressive government institutions, I'd say, is that actually Creative Scotland have a really, really bad reputation. And people are very derogatory about them in terms of the projects that they support and the way that they're supported. Arts Council England, although its funding is obviously always under review and essentially always being cut, is an amazing resource, because you can put an application in at any time during the year up to £15,000 and get a decision within 6 weeks about whether you're going to get that funding or not. And I think that is, I think it's an incredible resource, and I don't understand anybody. I can understand why people are critical of Arts Council, because it's good that there's critical dialogue around it. But from an artist perspective, I think that's amazing. And there's not many countries that do that. Like when you compare it to Ireland, for example, Ireland only has one tranche of funding that goes out once a year, and everybody puts their applications in for that one bit of funding. And if you don't get it, that's it. You've got to wait till next year. So we're actually really lucky.
Although Ireland does have that slight advantage where if you're an artist, you pay. Is it still the case where you still pay no tax?
I don't know about that. I'm not sure, but I don't think that.
I know that would be threatening to change that, but they have run that since the early 70s.
Right.
So there's been advantages the other way.
Right, that's interesting.
Well, presumably the same here, because most artists won't earn minimum wage tax anyway.
Yeah. But that's also because like Bono still lives in Ireland. Surprise, surprise.
Who's that, sorry?
Bono from U2.
Yeah, right.
Obviously you have to submit reports to them, telling them about how everything has gone.
Following up on that as well, so your project, Janice saying your project has a very ethnographic dimension. Now, was that something you expected beforehand? Did you approach it like that? You know, if you go back to the very beginning, you as I understand it, you understood about this cable running from these two places, and that was it, and it's kind of expanded into this whole thing. So did you approach it from an ethnographic point of view, even an anthropological point of view, or was it just you stumbled across all of that?
So I think there's probably one of the reasons that this project's been in gestation for like a long time, and you know, although I'm kind of frustrated in the last few months that Emma and I haven't made the progress we probably should have done, because we've both been pulled on other projects. I do believe that having a long period of time for creating something like this has allowed us to just dig and dig and dig and find more and more and more. You know, some people make films very quickly. I think Emma and I both take a long time. Like Emma makes one film a year. I make one film every year or two. Well, I want to make one film every year as well, but I don't actually want to make any more than that. Because I think it's good to have time to dig these layers out. I didn't want to, although The Power Line was the start point of the film, I didn't want to make another film about the materiality of technology, because it's been really well documented, it's done, you know, and I think these other layers are, to me, really fascinating and really interesting. And actually our big challenge now is, how do we get the complexity of everything we've been kind of talking about over the last 45 minutes, how do we get that across in a way that's interesting, but also in a way that isn't a documentary? Like this is art, and it needs to feel like art, and I don't want to make a documentary. And that's actually one of the biggest challenges.
Why not?
As well. Because I'm not a documentary filmmaker, I suppose. I want to create something that feels, you know, that feels like a piece of art. And I kind of, interestingly enough, not looking at my own work, because sometimes it's hard to critique in that way, but if you look at Emma Charles's work with White Mountain, one of the things we were working on, or she was working on, especially when she finished that film, was that UC had written this text to be spoken about over the top of the film, and it was very academic, and it was constant. You know, basically you had this film that was 20 minutes long, over which I'd say 16 minutes of it was a voice of narrative. You can't take that in. It's too much as a viewer to watch that. And actually, a huge component of White Mountain, you've seen the film in its, you know, in a proper gallery environment. The sound design is amazing, and it needs to be, you know, on good equipment and loud. And having a voiceover over that sound completely destroys that element of it. So actually, what she ended up doing over edits is pulling that voice and that voiceover back and back and back until maybe it only sits over 5 minutes of the film now. And the sound design does the work, and it's the sound design that makes that film feel like art and not feel like a documentary and not feel like a piece of work that's been made for academia, essentially. And I think you've got to be quite careful about that.
Does that also then relate to the way that it's shown? So,
yeah.
So you know, it does. Yeah, I've seen White Mountain, as you say, in that setting, and it's dramatically different to sitting here watching a little bit of it on some, you know, reasonable but not amazing speakers. So, is that what changes a piece of film from something that you go and sit in rows in a cinema and watch, or watch on your television, to something where is it kind of like the experience? You're going not just to watch something, you're going in a gallery setting. If installed correctly, then it's something that you are bodily experiencing.
That's a really good question. Like, I think, and it goes back to running the gallery, and to you can see through the work we've done with Emma, but also with Sebastian, about the fascination of how film operates in space. And what Emma and I will do is we will edit a single screen version of this film, but immediately after that we will edit a kind of diptych or a triptych or a version that's meant to be shown on multiple screens to create an environment within which the film can be experienced. And you're right, yeah, I think that will be a key part of the process, and we may never even show the film as a single screen installation. That may not happen. But equally, funny enough, I was at Tate, I went to catch the Rachel Whiteread before it shut at the weekend, and I didn't realise when I went, but they've got Elizabeth Price again, like the Turner Prize winning Choir of Woolworths. And that's a really good example for me of a film that straddles this idea of kind of fiction and reality in terms of documentary. Like, the fire at Woolworths was real, 20 people died. The fictional element was this choir that she brought into that film, that she's basically cited as this idea of Woolworths having a choir. And I haven't seen that film since I saw it originally in Turner Prize, and I went in there, and again, the sound design in that film completely blows me away. And you could only experience that sound within a gallery environment, because it's, well, not only gallery environment, it's 5:1, and it's powerful. And I totally recommend, if any of you are into film and have not seen that film, to go to Tate Britain and go and watch it while it's on, because personally I love it. I think it's an amazing film.
And it's on for the rest of this year.
Is it?
Nearly, I think, to the end of October. Yeah.
Right.
So it's.
How are you planning on making this available to other areas or people?
So we'll take it on tour. So it will go down to some things. It's going to a gallery in Birmingham. It's going down to Plymouth. It's going down to Cornwall. It's going down to Winchester in Southampton, where UC is. So it's going to the Hansard Gallery there. I can't remember where else it's going, to be honest with you. But one of the things that we've been speaking about is a gallery in London called Calvert 22, which is an amazing gallery and a really interesting gallery. And it's focuses on Russian and Eastern European art. And the shows there are really, really great, really interesting. And one of the last shows that I saw there was about, again, during the Cold War, Russia invested a huge amount of money in sound, both sound to be used, both weaponizing sound, so as a way to in conflict, but also actually challenging Western, I guess the Western way of documenting and creating music. And there was an amazing exhibition that was all these kind of, I can't remember the names and that's terrible, but Polish and Russian composers who created these incredible scores where they'd gone away from the traditional kind of scores as we use them and created these kind of circular forms that had kind of different ways of notating music. And it was an amazing exhibition, but yeah, Calvert 22 is another space that we're looking at to show the film, because there's obviously a very strong, USSR theme to that.
Because that's their particular focus.
That's their focus as a space. It's a really good space. It's on Calvert Avenue. If you're ever in Old Street, it's always worth going through the door. So it's a really, really good space.
I've sent those online. I've got all these links. I've been sending them all. I should probably copy and paste them to everybody else. But that's one of the advantages of being online.
Yeah.
You can quickly pull these things up and check. It's one of the dangers when you're doing a talk as well, because you know everybody's checking up on your facts live at the same time.
What have I said wrong?
I wanted to Google a few things when you were talking as well. Population of the city and things
right,
like that. Yeah.
So several of them got to go. We've got quite a lot of, in the first season, it's got a lot of teachers in the UK. So basically, the 1 till 3 is their extended lunchtime.
Right, okay.
And they kind of do a deal with their boss and then have to run off, literally run off and do some teaching. Or often they've got students banging on the door, for various reasons. So,
Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks for...
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Comments? You probably want to talk to Justin later because he's into sound recording and broadcasting.
Why didn't you like that trailer?
Pardon?
I come see it, you don't like the trailer.
We showed the trailer at a festival called Abandoned Normal Devices, which was on a few months ago in the Peak District. I just had to put it together quite quickly, and it's not. It's just not. It's not rich enough, and it's not really a true representation of what we're trying to do. But it's that's why I was kind of saying it's more just a collection of almost scenes at the moment. It's not that I hate it. It's just not. It's not what I want to make. So.
Have you heard of a short film about Andorra? Because it made me think of that a little bit. This little country in between Spain and France.
Oh yeah.
Where many people go to just buy cigarettes or alcohol.
Yeah.
It's like some kind of it's a very interesting place, and there's a short film about it. It made me think of that a little bit because it's just one of those places it's kind of like a transit place where people still live there, and it looks a bit weird and futuristic as well. The capital, only town. It looks a bit strange.
Yeah. Apparently that's interesting. Have a look at that.
Yeah, I can find out. I don't remember exactly what the title is, but I can find out.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So we've all got our own magnetic field, haven't we? Is that right?
I don't know.
Okay, I was just wondering if we could measure it. I mean, if it's sensitive enough to measure it, we can have some quite fun with that. But, maybe just make it up.
One thing I'm really interested in, like, from your two perspective, like, with, like, what the, how you view Astana in particular, from kind of a Russian perspective.
Well, I only know one person from Astana.
Right.
I haven't been there, and I've never heard about it before. I knew this person, so I don't really know what to say.
Yeah,
that's like Cyrillic, which I understood.
Say again, sorry?
Cyrillic, which I understood, the language. That's probably it. Also, I know that she's quite rich because there are loads of people, so you can kind of make business from scratch and live with it. That's all I heard.
Yeah.
That's all I know.
I can suggest that probably Kazakhstan is a poor country than Russia, and that's why most of gastarbeiters and illegal workers they go illegally work in Moscow and other big cities. They earn money there and bring them into Kazakhstan for their families, and this is a very big problem, especially in Moscow. It's a very big problem in the whole Russia because most of people they take out money from our country and they take our working places, and and probably that's why we don't know so much about Kazakhstan and Astana, because we don't find any sense to visit it. Like, I know it should be a very beautiful country because I have seen some pictures and its nature from photos, but it's very close.
Right.
It's very close to us because you see they have their own language, but it seems like most of people still speak and learn Russian.
Yeah.
Because it's also they need it for some economic reason, for political reason, and it would be for us. It would be more interesting to see in other countries, in other cultures, like I don't know, China, for example, like India, who are also close to us, but they absolutely
different culturally.
Rather than Kazakhstan. And we also need to make a visa for visiting Kazakhstan, and this is also like a kind of problem.
That's really interesting because we didn't need visas.
We need to make visa for visiting Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Poland, like all ex countries who go into USSR. We now have to make visas, and I would say it's more they lose more money from this point of view, because we don't visit them and we don't interested in their cultures, in their countries at all, because we have more problems with making it.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting.
If you have more questions, we can answer. We have no problems. I can send you my email.
Yeah, that would be amazing, actually. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm just going to stop the broadcast now.
Yeah.
Just